Amor TV. We are the best friends.
Well, thank you very much for that lovely introduction, Jason. I'm not going to stand behind that thing. I'm going to dive behind it from time to time to move the screens forward. I'm acutely conscious of the fact that it's a big topic and I've got about 28 minutes. And I also would like very much to leave time, significant time at the end of my own remarks to get input from some of you. May I have a show of hands? How many people here are or have taught with Oerberg's Lingua Latina per se illustrata? Okay, very good. Hands down, please. Thank you. How many have not but are thinking about it? Okay, great. And how many have done it and have moved away from it to something else? Okay, a few. All right, good. So we've got people in every camp. Full disclosure here, I'm trying to be as even-handed as possible. I am definitely not here to trash the memory of Hans Oerberg, God forbid. But I am on the side of Oerberg, and I am going to try to persuade those of you who are thinking about it to try it. That said, however, I do have some things to say based on 10 years of working with this book and with other books in the series. And for you who are considering adopting this textbook, I feel I owe it to you, and those of us who have been working with Oerberg for a while owe it to you to alert you to some of the things that we think you need to know before you make that move. If you do, your experience and your students' experience with Oerberg, I think, will be much happier and even more successful than mine have been. And I am still using it, just not exclusively. Without further ado, then, here is my programmatic statement. I identify, without having meditated on it for an immense amount of time, but there are 4 essential virtues in this book that leapt out at me immediately when I decided I would do this talk. 4 significant difficulties, and 3, issues of student mentality. 3 things I've noticed broadly in the students that I've worked with all over the place at Wyoming Catholic College, where I was for a decade, and now at Belmont Abbey College, that have to be taken into account when using this book or making the decision to use it or not. And then, conclusion, I have anticipated myself by saying my ultimate yay or nay is a yay. Do use Oerberg, but be aware of the caveats. So here we go. All right, obvious essential virtues, latine tantum. Several years ago, I took a look in some book that purported to be an index of all the Latin textbooks currently in print at the time, and I found that at that time, which was about 5 or 6 years ago, there were 57 introductory Latin textbooks currently in print. I have not worked with all 57 of them. I did scan the titles. I've worked with a lot of the major ones. I've taught Wheelock, I've taught Cambridge, I've taught Ecce Romani. I've dabbled around a little bit in Oxford. There could be a better book than Oerberg out there, but I'm not aware of it. I said then, and I still say to students now, that the reason I'm giving them Oerberg is because it is the best introductory Latin textbook available. I'll have to put an asterisk on that because it's starting to get some competition, which is a great thing for us. That's good news. How wonderful that there should be books coming in at the top instead of at the bottom. But it is still the only major, widely known Latin textbook out there that uses no other language except for Latin to convey its meaning and to convey the language to the students. That is at one and the same time a huge advantage and also a problem of significant dimensions. And I will get into that in just a couple of minutes. Another of its virtues is the absence of what I call, and some of you may find this offensive, I apologize if you do, English language filler. Cambridge in particular is chock full of pages and pages of historical and cultural content in English, which is information that is certainly good and valuable for its own sake. But the bottom line for me is it's not Latin. If you subscribe to Stephen Krashen's input hypothesis that learning a foreign language happens when students are getting comprehensible input in the target language, 3 legs of a tripod, students are not learning Latin when they are reading those English language pages of Cambridge. Again, that doesn't mean they're not learning something that has value, but whatever it is, it's still not Latin. We have a ridiculously small time as Latin teachers to try and get our students to learn Latin. In my opinion, I'll speak for myself and just say, I don't feel I can afford to spend time doing much else than trying to convey the language. Now, many of you, I think, are forced by your schools, by your curricula, by your principals and headmasters, by your parents, to include large amounts of cultural and historical content in your classes, which simply cannot conveniently be conveyed in Latin, unless you're going to give Tacitus's Annales to somebody in Latin too. It's just not possible. So I understand that, but nevertheless, I am going to let that stand and say that the absence of English language content, no matter how valuable it may be in itself, is an advantage in Oerberg. Point the third, it fits wonderfully well with modern language, what I go so far as to call authentic language teaching methodology. I felt as if I had opened a door into a bright, big, wonderful world the day I stepped out of Wheelock and into Oerberg and started using Rossius method with Oerberg's book. And it works well with TPR, with TPRS, with all sorts of things. It is crafted with immense care, subtlety, and consistency because Oerberg's book represents half a century of a man's life. Oerberg put his entire life into honing and perfecting his book, and he was an intelligent man who had a deep knowledge of the language, and it shows quite literally in every single page in a manner that I have not observed in any other textbook. Difficulties. And the first one is really the big kahuna, in my opinion. The thinking required to use Oerberg's book does not come naturally to students. I thought it would when I started 10 years ago, because it said in a page, maybe it was page 2 or page 3 of the introduction, that it was nature method. Hurrah, nature method. This must come naturally. I can give them the book, and of course they'll look through, and they'll look at the index, and they'll be logical, and they'll ask themselves, oh, if we've got 2 subjects, then this verb must be plural. You can imagine how far that got me. I was greatly, sometimes I think they're just going to write on my gravestone, she assumed. Because I have made more calamitous assumptions in my life than anybody else I know. And to assume that reading Oerberg and using Oerberg correctly would come naturally to my students was a huge mistake, and it took me several years really to absorb its full import. More about that in a minute. The text does not support living Latin as much as one might think. Luigi Miraglia was single-handedly responsible, I have been told, credibly or not, I don't know, but single-handedly responsible for the adoption of Oerberg by over 1,000 secondary schools in Italy, because he is such a big proponent of Oerberg, and because through him so many of us have become proponents of Oerberg. It would be easy for you to think, oh, you, my auditor, who is thinking about using this book, it would be easy to suppose that it must necessarily work hand in glove with the principles of living Latin. It doesn't. It's simply 80 times better than anything else you will come across. Great divides in the book. I'll be talking about that in about 3 minutes and 48 seconds. There are several sort of fissure points in the book where students just kind of grind to a halt. I'm going to tell you where they are so that you, if you decide to use this book, can get in ahead and start pre-teaching your feet off in order not to have this problem. And then the problem of the pensa. I've got some things to say about the little homework assignments called pensa at the end of each chapter. So first things first, thinking, and that really is, okay, well, 3 issues concerning student, well, we might have to come back to that. All right, okay. All right, thinking, here we go. You're looking at the first page of the 2nd chapter of Familia Romana. This is the chapter, incidentally, where students are introduced to really noticeable case inflections. They're in there in chapter 1, but in the context of in and the ablative. There's a map. You get sentences like Gallia est in Europa, Italia quoque in Europa est. So because we have the word in English, students read that first chapter very easily and they think, oh, hurrah, I get Latin. Because it seems like just a kind of odd form of English to them. Chapter 1 is so easy that I've seen it set students up for big trouble in chapter 2. Now, when I say the kind of thinking necessary to use this book effectively does not come naturally to students, well, let me show you what I do to try and teach them that kind of thinking. If you're teaching Wheelock, if you're teaching, maybe nobody teaches Wheelock anymore. I'm not as young as I think I am. How many of you are still teaching Wheelock? Okay, all right, well, brothers, handshake, all right. Teachers always say, oh, you know, I just want to teach Latin and instead I have to teach English grammar all the time, because Wheelock is full of English grammatical terms and our students don't know what they are. Teaching with Oerberg will get you out of that bag, because you will not find an explicitly English grammatical term in the entire book. That's the good news. The bad news is that you're going to spend what may feel like an equal amount of time, whether or not it actually is, teaching them what I call Oerbergology, teaching them how to think in the right way to use this book. And I have discovered, and it took me a long time really to accept this, but you cannot be too detailed, you cannot be too obvious in teaching them how to do this. You don't believe me, but you will in a second. That same image up here is also here. I've given you this image because it doesn't have the title Familia Romana. What I do when my students get to this chapter, and I have some students right now who just started learning Latin, and so I did this with them a couple of weeks ago. I showed them the picture without any Familia Romana title, and I said, what do you see? To which they said, a family. And so I said, why? Defend that. Why do you think this is a family? And so they say, well, there's a man and there's a woman and there are little kids in between them. And I said, well, why do you think they're kids? They could be dwarves. And they said, well, they're small people in between 2 adults, and the little girl kind of looks baby-faced. So I said, well, okay, all right, I'll give you that. It is a family. Those are kids, and they're kids also because they're shorter, right? How else do you know they're kids? They're their kids because they're wearing the same kind of clothes that mom and dad are wearing. Yes. One of my students just this term astonished me by pointing out, and it's evident on the more recent illustration, not this, but the highlights in Marcus's hair are actually in the same shape as the highlights in Julius's hair, suggesting that they have the same head shape and that therefore they are father and son, which of course they are. It's even true to a lesser extent with Julia and Emilia. The level of detail here, I said Oerberg put his whole life into this book, and he really did, although he didn't do the drawings. But I have them, okay, I give them that. All right, yes, it's a family, but who are these people? Well, that would be a whole fan fiction story in itself. Where's Joel here? All right. Okay. These other people, I ask them, oh, are they part of the family too? No. Why do you, well, really? I mean, they're up there. Who are they? And so I ask the students, and we talk through the fact that these people are wearing much similar clothing. They're the same age or older than the parents, and they don't look particularly happy. I made them get up and stand in the posture in which Matus is standing, which is like this. You can't be happy if you're standing like this. Again, I'm taking time to show you that the level to which you have to go in terms of detail and stating the obvious in order to teach them the kind of observational skills that they've got to have in order to use this book. Some of your kids will get all this instantly, but you as the teacher have got to be sure that all of your kids have got this. And even the bright ones who get some of it will not have noticed some of these other details. I always quote Holmes and Watson to them. You know how Holmes and Watson go to a crime scene and they come out 10 minutes later and Holmes has solved the case? And Watson says, by Jove, Holmes, that's absolutely extraordinary. We were both in the same room, we solved the same things, but you've solved the case and I haven't got the faintest idea who did it. And Holmes simply coolly replies, Watson, well, it's elementary. You saw, but you did not observe. Our kids don't know how to observe. When I started at Belmont Abbey College in August, the admissions people came in to give us orientation, which was really more disorientation because we were all told that the average 18 to 22-year-old now has an attention span of 8 seconds. In other words, every 8 seconds, either their mind is going to start to wander off task or something has to help them refocus. So talking them through, that does not give you time to make any kind of observation about a picture like this, which isn't even moving, let alone not dancing or flashing. And I don't mean to mock our students. I'm sorry for them. I'm addicted enough to my iPhone that I shudder to think what would have happened to me if I had had one since I was 18. But, all right, to move on quickly, very quickly. Pensa, well, let's go, okay, thinking skills, all right? Text does not support living Latin as much as one might suppose, given its popularity among active Latin teachers. The single piece of proof of this that I have to offer is the fact that in Oerberg you will not see a single verb form that is first person or second person until chapter 15. And for most of us teaching at the high school level, you know, that means that you're going to go a whole year without ever saying video or audio te or id-shio. And you can't converse, you can converse with your students. You can teach them these forms, but you will not get any written support for what you are teaching them unless you create it yourself. And many teachers have been very industrious and have created their own materials, and that's great. But if you're thinking about using this book, you need to know, if you want to pair it with conversational Latin, that you will not get any support for first or second person verb forms until your second year, if you're going by the book alone. Great divides in the book and the problem of the pensa. I've really got to move here. Reorder the pensa. You're looking at pensum che, which, as all of you know, is whole questions which have to be answered with complete sentences based on the content of the chapter. Before that is pensum be, which requires the insertion of individual vocabulary words into context in the sentence. And before that is pensum a. And what does pensum a ask students to do? Put endings on. So it's a very logical progression from the small to the larger, right? From the ending to the word to the sentence. That makes all kinds of logical sense. The problem is that the state of our science now suggests that the human brain absorbs language in exactly the opposite order. We start with chunks and we move down to minutiae. So at the very least, what we would need to do to make these pensa brain-friendly would be to make this pensum a, and pensum be would be the whole words, and pensum che would be the endings. If I had my way, there would actually be 2 or 3 more pensa. There would be pictures, and you'd have to match the content of particular paragraphs to pictures, and then you would have to answer questions like this, but by means of quoting back sentences from the chapter without having to make up your own. You would make up your own, but you would do that as the very last thing you do. So this needs a reordering according to the best of our available learning science. All right. Let's see. Great divides. If you want to know where they are, come see me after and I'll tell you. I mentioned chapter 15. I mentioned, yeah.
It's just the coffee hour.
Really? I'm competing with a coffee urn? Dang it. They say never act with a kid or an animal, and here I am up here with a coffee urn. Okay, all right. I thought there was another, well, I'm still not going to abutere paciencia vestra, but all right, okay. Okay. I think I have covered the first 2. So great divides. Did I have a list of that? No. Oops, sorry. Where is that? Excuse me. These are out of... Okay. Was tempted to put a picture of Hadrian's Wall in here for great divides. There's a fissure already between chapter 1 and chapter 2. Because chapter 1, as I said, the Latin is so like the English that students get a false confidence that they can just blah, 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 read it along and understand, and they don't really have to think about what they're looking at. Whereas chapter 2, bam, hits them with Julii and Marci and Quinti and all these genitive case forms. Chapter 6 already introduces the passive voice. When does Wheelock put the passive in? It's something like chapter 23, 24. You spend a long time with Latin and Wheelock before you have to worry about the passive voice. And the problem here, we have a cultural problem with this, that the Danes and the Germans and practically everybody else on earth does not have. English teachers and English writers have been trying to stamp out the passive voice for 200 years. When I was in high school, my honors English teacher told me specifically, do not use she graded down my essay and she told me, do not use the passive voice, it is bad English. So our students now lack the concept of passivity in language. I've done weird things like trying to introduce Passive Voice Day at Wyoming Catholic College, in which everybody would have to say everything in the passive. It never really took off, unfortunately. But here you go through Oerberg, and all of a sudden in chapter 6, you are dealing with Latin that is covering a concept that they don't have a framework for if they are English mother tongue people, such as many of us are. That's a problem, and I have not got an instant solution for that one. Chapter 8 is huge. Even Luigi Miraglia complains about Oerberg chapter 8, that it's because it's got interrogative pronouns, relative pronouns, so quis and quid and quorum and quibus and hic and haec and is, all in the same, oh, and 40 more new vocabulary words, all in the same chapter. It really needs to be broken up into, I'd say, about 3 chapters. And, you know, it's easy for me to stand up here and criticize Oerberg. I haven't written a textbook. We've all heard that old saw, those who can do and those who can't criticize. I'm not leveling these criticisms at Oerberg because I think I necessarily could do any better. Again, my purpose is to inform those of you who are thinking about using this book where you might run into trouble, so you can start thinking now about doing it. I still say it's worth doing. It's eminently worth doing. But, again, be prepared. Chapter 13, students tend to choke on it because it is all about, the point of it is to introduce the 5th declension. So they're using the word dies. And therefore, the whole chapter is about calendars and times of the year, and its content is, except for about the last 20 lines, the content is wholly expository. It is depersonalized. It's not about Quintus and Marcus and Julia anymore. It's not about people they know. It's about abstract, intangible ideas like seasons and weeks and stuff. So students choke on that because it's conceptually different. 15, I mentioned that. That's where you have to get to if you want to see all 6 persons of the indicative. You'll notice that trouble chapters thin out. If they can make it through chapter 15, then they've got something and they can work with it. I noticed trouble again in chapter 29 for some of the same reasons that 13 is a problem, because chapter 29 is an extended narration of the Greek myth of Arion. And again, it's different people that they're not used to hearing about in a different context. Of course, there is Theseus and the Minotaur in 25, but for whatever reason, kids have trouble with 29 and they don't with 25. Classis Romana 32 is historical content, and it's their introduction to Latin history in Latin, which is a wonderful thing. But again and again, I've had students who sort of shy, you know, when they get to that. So if you're going to do this, get in there and do some preparatory exercises before you do it. Finally, then, oops, I'm going the wrong way, not for the first time. All right, almost the penult conclusion here. Student mentality. The answers, okay. You may be aware that there's a whole sort of Oerberg industry out there. There are a whole lot of other titles, mostly on the high end of things. We need more low end stuff. If anybody is interested in writing like Oerberg novellas, go for it. We need more things to read that are easier for the students to read. Books like the wonderful Jean O'Neill's College Companion or its progenitor, Latine Disco, they are guidebooks in English to the Oerberg book. I introduced them at Wyoming Catholic College, and I was 3 years trying to recover. And I understand why they were written, and I respect the decisions of the authors to write them. But I found that my students, and I think my students aren't very different from yours, as soon as they had an English book to read about Latin, they clung to that like a lifeline because they were convinced that that book contained the answers to Oerberg. And they never really engaged with Oerberg himself again. So, and yet, there are many places where you're given Oerberg and you're given a year to get through it. That's what happens in many colleges. And what are you going to do? I mean, you have to get people through somehow. But admittedly, an English guidebook to the Oerberg text is no longer lingua latina per se illustrata, is it? So, kids, don't we all? I mean, we're all busy, but kids sit down to do the pensa, and they want to get them done. I teach at a Catholic college, so I ask my kids, do you say a rosary to get done with the beads? That's not the point. And doing these pensa, the point is not to get them done. The point is to use them as a gauge to see whether or not you have read the chapter often enough, thoroughly enough, attentively enough. You'll know when you do because the pensa will just flow, whether you're doing them on a computer or writing. So if you're choking and wheezing and getting all kinds of hints on the computer programs, you're ahead of yourself. You need to go back and read and think. Finally, the last one, and this is a biggie, and it's back to Oerbergology to conclude. In every other class that your students have, their English class, their history class, their science class, they are skimming the textbooks for content. If you do that with Oerberg, you're going to get absolutely nothing because, in a manner of speaking, Oerberg is the incredible content-free book. There is no content, really, because there never was a Marcus or a Quintus or a Julia. The medium is the message with Oerberg, and if you don't, you have to put all of your attention into not what's being said, but how it's being said and why it means what it's trying to say, if you're going to get out of it what you need to. And that is diametrically opposed to the entire reading culture that the rest of their classes inculcate in them. So I'm just going to stop here because I know that some of us are probably getting critically caffeine deficient. But I want to leave this on a positive note. My colleague Jerry Malsbury at Belmont Abbey College said very quotably that Oerberg's book is an adventure in thinking, and it absolutely is. One way you can sell Oerberg to your headmaster or your principal is to tell them, and you will be telling the truth, that doing Oerberg's book, and I mean really doing it, in Latin, per se illustrata, will give your kids an extended tutorial in critical thinking, real critical thinking, unlike anything they're going to get in any English class they ever take. That's number one. But handle it with care if you do it. Maybe you might want to use it together with other texts, like Forum, just out of Polis now. I'm using that this year. Beyond Oerberg, well, you see Oerberg in 1955 working on his book, and you see him probably in about 2009, the year before he died, still working on his book. He was an intelligent, sensitive man who really did put all of himself and all of his life into it. I hope, and I think he would hope too, that the day will come when not only we don't use Cambridge anymore, but we don't use Wheelock anymore, and we don't use Ecce anymore, but we even don't use Oerberg anymore. The day, I hope, will come when we will have other books that really do fully support a whole language, active language approach, and we're all here because we're interested in doing that. But even if that day comes on the 16th iteration of this conference, or the 26th, or the 36th, when, God willing, I'll be pushing up the daisies, we will still owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to Oerberg, because wherever we go collectively with the Living Latin movement, he will stand sort of at the roots of the tree that Quintus falls out of in chapter 10. All right, he will be there as one of the founders and one of the propugnatores and progenitores of everything that we're doing. So I hope this has been helpful to you. I went on a lot longer than I intended to, but I guess, as Reggie Foster used to say, sic friat crustulum. I'll tell you what, anybody who wants to go, God bless you. Anybody who'd like to stay for a few minutes and share perspectives, because there are a lot of you that have taught with Oerberg and have excellent input, I'm happy as a clam to stay. And if you want to stay and talk more, let's do it. But allow me just to thank you for your kind attention and your patience.